Hi everyone, and this is a bit of historical then and now, which will also merge into a Georgian era murder mystery whodunit, which has never been solved to this day. But I wanted to start off with these images because we're looking at the Roman Aldgate, and we're going to pick up after we've finished with the images I'm going to be showing you. We're going to pick up back in 2023 in the same area, so I wanted to share some of this history with you. It's thought that a gate, the Aldgate, spanned the road to Colchester in the Roman period when the London Wall was constructed. The gateway, which probably had two circular towers, stood at the corner of modern Duke's Place on the east side of the city, with a busy thoroughfare passing through it. It was rebuilt between 1108 and 1147 and again in 1215 and reconstructed completely between 1607 and 1609. The interesting and Aldgate name is a derivative from the Old English for Old Gate, and that's where it gets its name, because it was part of the London Wall, a wall which once enclosed the square mile of the city. These gates were all eventually taken down because they became an inconvenience for travel. As I say, completely reconstructed between 1607 and 1609 in a more classical and less functional style. Like London's other gates, Aldgate was fortified with portcullises and chained in 1377 due to concerns about potential attacks by the French. The gate was finally removed in 1761. It was temporarily re-erected at Bethnal Green as a folly, but was taken down soon afterwards. Now, the young man, our murder victim, that's going to appear in this series wouldn't have known the Aldgate because it was before his time. But this is Aldgate High Street, and this is very much the world that our young man would have known. This image dates from 1805, so this is the world and Aldgate High Street that he would have known and walked through. This is 1812, so this is just 2 years after his unfortunate murder. A nice little watercolour image. Shows the Turk's Head pub as well, apart from some of the old buildings. I love this image. This is early photography, and because of the exposure times and the cameras and that, it just couldn't pick up anything that was moving without turning it into a complete blur, which if you look down into the road, that's what you can see. But it shows London and Aldgate High Street as the busy thoroughfare it always has been and still is to this day. This is latter Victorian period, 1890s, and you can see the horse-drawn omnibus, the barrow boy with his barrow, and cobbled streets, and in the distance there is the spire of the church of St Botolph without Aldgate, which is going to be the location we're heading to eventually in our video, which is the burial location of our murder victim. This picture isn't dated, but it's late Victorian era by the looks of it, and as I say, it just shows some of the old buildings and the world that our young man Thomas would have come from. This is dated 1908, and as you can see, it shows the Aldgate East railway station, Aldgate railway station, and just behind the buildings there, most of which are gone and were swept away in both World Wars, is the spire of Aldgate St Botolph without Aldgate. 1906. A lot of horse-drawn traffic, but if you look where the lamppost is and just slightly to its right, you'll see our first motor vehicle. This is Aldgate High Street, and look at what a busy road it was, and it is still very busy. Aldgate East 1910. Traffic outside Aldgate East Underground Station in London. And you got your bobby there directing traffic. A motorised omnibus. Still horses and carts about. Another man with a barrow over to the right. But more motorised vehicles. And this is dated 1937 and is right outside Aldgate East Station and shows the trams going up and down and the very, very busy crowds. So we're going to leave 1937 and jump forward to 2023. So join me in the present for a very different looking Aldgate High Street. Join me there. And welcome back to the present. Very different world, wasn't it, eh? And this is where that wall and that gate stood. There's the marker stones for it here, look. Site of the London Wall. And over here you can take the London Wall walk, which is probably something I'll do. I know I normally get moaned at sometimes, especially on YouTube, for pointing at the floor, but there is a purpose to it in this one. Site of Aldgate. So the old wall and the Aldgate that we saw, which is apparently a derivation of the Old Gate. This is where we are now in 2023. This is the church of St Botolph's without Aldgate, not to be mistaken with the church at St Botolph's without Aldersgate. Two different churches opposite side of London. So one is near Farringdon and Smithfield and the other one is here in Aldgate. So you've seen a little bit of the past of what it was like, but one of my main reasons to come in here is I want to show you to this day unsolved Georgian murder whodunit mystery. So we're just walking through its churchyard. Now this churchyard they sold a large chunk of it off in the late 80s and through 1990. They needed money and the churchyard was sold, big chunks of it, and this out there is what was all created in its place. I can't point out there too much because there's people there, but this is the church. And it's a nice church. Cool, look at all the flies, look. Good Lord. And sadly the fountain isn't on today, but I did this recording about a week or two ago and I wasn't happy with it, so I'm back here doing it again today. So in here on my phone I still can merge in a bit of this in action, so you'll see this working and then rejoin me in the churchyard. And you join me in what's left of the churchyard of St Botolph's without Aldgate. Much of the churchyard was cut back and taken away because in 1990 the remains of 6,000 people were moved from this churchyard to East London Cemetery. But what I want to show you, I hope you all jolly well enjoyed that. And now the main thing we've come here for is a gravestone, which no longer marks the grave on which it was placed, because as I said, a large section of this churchyard was sold late 80s, early 90s, but some of the more interesting gravestones were placed along the wall here, so sadly it doesn't mark this young man's grave anymore. But this is an interesting Georgian, to this day, unsolved murder whodunit. Now a lot of the writing has worn away on the stone, particularly at the lower part, and this stone, it was much taller. We're lucky and grateful really, because there was a man in the early 1900s called Mr. Percy Edge who worked with and around and for this church. Anyway, he went around and did a book of monumental inscriptions, marked down still all the visible inscriptions on the stones, which was fairly early really, because most of the churches didn't do that until the 1930s. So this was an early one, and I've got the transcript on my phone, so I'm going to pause you a sec while I get that out, and then I shall read. Here we are. Now, sacred to the memory of Thomas Ebrall, citizen and corn meter, which is a corn merchant, who was shot by a lifeguardsman on the 9th of April 1810 in the shop of Mr Goodeve in Fenchurch Street, and died on the 17th of the same month in the 24th year of his age. Now, bearing in mind he was shot on the 9th and didn't die until the 17th. And this is on the original stone. The coroner's inquest brought in a verdict of murdered by lifeguardsman unknown. And then below that is a verse. Thus saith the Lord, my right hand shall not spare the sinners, and my sword shall not cease over them that shed innocent blood upon the earth. And then below that, which I think is a shame that you can no longer see because it's cemented away, also Mr Thomas Ebrall, who, worn out with grief for the loss of the above dutiful son, departed this life August the 23rd 1810, aged 48. So the dad basically died of grief for the loss of the son. Anyway, as I say, this is an unsolved whodunit, and with a fair bit of research and to and fro, I managed to, with some friends' help, get access to transcripts and copies of the original coroner's inquest. Now, it's an interesting one with this one because Thomas Ebrall here, he was in the shop of Mr Goodeve in Fenchurch Street. Now, Mr Goodeve's shop was a hosier's shop. Remember in those days that men didn't wear full-length trousers, they wore knee-length breeches and hose, which are stockings. So basically Thomas was in there in a stocking shop buying a pair of hose or talking to the owner. It didn't record that. Anyway, a lifeguardsman with hat pulled down low and collar pulled up high walked into the shop and shot Thomas Ebrall and just basically walked out. The man had tried to aim for the heart and missed, and Thomas Ebrall collapsed onto the floor. Mr Goodeve's wife come running out and screamed because there was blood all over the place and it wasn't a nice scene, and that alerted people. But this supposed lifeguardsman, in the coroner's records, several local people said that they didn't think it was a real lifeguardsman because the man carried himself nothing like a guardsman. His hair was nothing like two. He was scarred and he had the wrong type of gun. Now, another witness, and this is interesting in the records because this little statement was struck through with a line, but it's still readable. Another witness called Mr Thomas Clark, who was a chimney sweep, and he stated that he believed that Thomas had been shot because he'd been having a clandestine relationship with another man's wife, and that obviously couldn't be proven, so they struck it off the record. But it's an interesting suggestion, isn't it? And when Thomas was shot, he collapsed onto the floor, and there was no ambulances or anything in those days, so a shutter was taken down off of Mr Goodeve's shop, and Thomas was laid on it and taken home to his parents' house. He lingered there from the 9th till the 17th and died of his wounds. Now, when he was shot, immediately afterwards, the parish constable and the beadle were immediately sent for. They got together a posse or a search party and set out in search of this supposed lifeguardsman. In the coroner's records, it does note down that when the man shot Thomas, he left the shop as cool as a cucumber, basically, and disappeared into the Edoing crowd of London, which upon that day was busy. So they never found him. Some people suggested, as said, that it wasn't a real lifeguardsman. Another man suggested that this man Thomas here may have been shot because he was having a bit of nookie with some other bloke's wife, but they struck that off, obviously because there was no proof of it. And that's slander, isn't it, then and now? But it's an interesting scenario, isn't it? So he died, Thomas, and obviously the poor father died after him. And that really is kind of where the story ended. They searched for a while, they couldn't find no one, and it is to this day still an unsolved East End whodunit from the Georgian era. Now, as I say, this gravestone does not mark its original grave anymore. That grave and those remains in there of Thomas Senior and Junior was dug up when the churchyard was sold, and the remains of 6,000 people, including the two Thomases here, were put into a mass grave in East London Cemetery. Their remains were all cremated and given a proper church service with a stone and everything. What we're going to do first is I'm going to give you a little view of Thomas's Weald, the Fenchurch Street of the 18th century, where he was killed. I'm sorry if I've forgotten. Hang on. No, I was right. It was Fenchurch Street. Good old me. Yeah. So we're going to see the Fenchurch Street of the 18th century, the location where Thomas was killed, and we'll get a little view of what an 18th century funeral would have been like, because they were quite different to our own. Very sombre and very different. So I'll show you that first, take you a little back into Thomas's world and the world of his poor parents and the aftermath of the death, and we'll see the Fenchurch Street of the late, just say 18th century. This is 1810, so the early 19th century, the late Georgian era. So we're going to pop back there now and we'll see that, and then at the end of the video I'm going to take you to the grave in East London Cemetery where those 6,000 remains, including the two Thomases here, now rest. So back off into the past and into the location of the murder in Fenchurch Street. And here we are. The little blue arrow at the bottom points to the row of shops. One of those shops was the shop of Mr. Goodeve, the hosier. So that's the location where young Thomas would have been shot. This is the Fenchurch Street of Thomas's time and era that he well would have recognised. This is early 19th century, this image, so bang on the time. Fenchurch. This is a late 18th century, early 19th century guardsman. So you can see the type of garb that the fellow would have had on that would have come in and shot him. And most of these, as you can see, are armed with swords. And the guardsmen were quite middle to upper class. So they wouldn't have been some beaten up, scarred up fellow with scruffy long hair, as the one that killed Thomas was described as. Looked nothing like a guardsman. So it really does make you wonder about this unsolved one. And this is an 18th century illustration of someone being shot. So just for our purposes, it gives you a little gist of the situation. And as I said in the story, the man just left the shop as cool as a cucumber and disappeared into the London crowd. The bright uniform and that suggests that he could have well lived nearby and got into a house, and the uniform probably would have been burned or discarded, something like that. But London had so many little nooks and alleyways that on a busy day it would be easy to just vanish down one of those alleyways and not be seen again. Now, as I said, when Thomas was shot, there were no ambulances in those days, and there were hospitals. You had the London Hospital, but most people died at home, and if you were taken ill in the street and people knew you, you would be carried home, and the call would be send for a shutter. And we're looking at a shop with the old 18th, this is 19th century, but these are 18th century shutters, so one of these would be taken down, you'd be laid on it and taken home. This is a parish beadle, the man that was sent for straight away when Thomas was shot. Like Mr. Bumble the beadle, these were real people, and they carried the local authority to arrest, form a posse or a search group, and that's exactly what happened. And the parish constable is a man like old Charlie here that you're seeing. He's an interesting story all in his own self. But this is a parish constable, so along with the beadle who gave the orders and whatnot, Charlie and men like him would have done the dirty work and gone out and searched for the fella that shot Thomas. And as I said, they never found him. Thomas, as we said, was carried home, and he died there, didn't he? I mean, he was shot on the 9th of April 1810 in the shop of Mr. Goodeve, and he died on the 17th. So he was taken home on the 9th and lingered and died, and he was 24 years old. Funerals in those days and how the dead were dealt with were very, very different to how we deal with it. Mostly we die in a hospital, and we're taken away and dealt with by the undertaker, all the nasty bits and bobs and pieces like that. In those days it was very different. Most people died at home and the body would stay in the home. Hence where the word, like the term wake, comes from, because don't forget, this is in an era where many people were actually buried alive because they didn't understand comas and things like that. So families would sit and watch a body, hence the wake, to see if it woke or showed any signs of life. I mean, with Thomas, he was gone, wasn't he, bless him? But he would have died at home and his family would have washed and cleaned him. Then a coffin maker or an undertaker would have been sent for to supply a coffin. They would measure you, you'd still be laying at home, then a coffin would be sent for and you'd be laid in that coffin at home with simple garlands and things like that, usually of bay and other strongly scented things, because unless you were embalmed, things got smelly pretty quick. And bearing in mind that Thomas, I mean, he was buried about a week or so after he died, so he was either possibly embalmed or buried in a lead-lined coffin. Thomas came from a middle-class family, and the sad thing is with his story is, and the heartbreak for his father, Thomas's father was a furniture and sash window maker. He obviously didn't want Thomas to follow into the same trade, so he set him up in an apprenticeship to become a corn merchant, which would have been a good trade in those days. And young Thomas hadn't long passed from his apprenticeship, and it's well noted in the coroner's records that Thomas's father was completely inconsolable. They couldn't even deal with him at the inquest or talk to him because he was so inconsolable. And it notes that all he kept crying was, "My boy," and he only just set out upon the world. So it's bloody awful, heartbreaking story. But as I say, funerals were, and death was dealt with in the home in those days, so Thomas would have died at home in his bed. His family would have washed and cleaned him, the coffin would have been sent for, he would have been coffined, and being a middle class family. And I've had some really kind help from St Botolph's, the church themselves nowadays, with some of the records that they have. There's no record of the parish coffin or a parish pool having been used, so that shows that Thomas's family footed the whole bill for the funeral themselves, including the gravestone, which would have been, with funeral and gravestone, would have been a fair expense in those days, as it still is. This is an early 19th century hearse, the kind that would have been used by the middle classes, and this is what likely Thomas's coffin and coffin body would have been conveyed to the funeral in, unless he lived very, very nearby the church. Then you would see a scene like this, where the bearers with a pall, the covering that covers over the coffin, would come right down and cover the bearers as well. So, and then you'd have the chief mourners in front with their sticks of office and whatnot, and behind is an inconsolable man. So although this is not Thomas's funeral, I thought it's right from the era. This is 1809, this funeral, so this is 1 year before Thomas's, and I thought with the poor inconsolable man, it was very fitting for the situation, for what happened with Thomas. And we go to funerals, the body in a motorised horse, sometimes still a horse-drawn hearse if you ask for it, but the family will go in cars. In those days, if the funeral was nearby, the family would have walked behind the hearse, and bearing in mind that Thomas and his family they came from the Minories, which is near the Tower of London, but is covered, that's the parish for St Botolph, so that's where they would have lived. So it's highly likely that the funeral, because it's only a 3 or 4 minute walk, would have gone on foot, or if they'd wanted a hearse, that's what they would have got, something like that, what we've just seen. But either way, hearse or on foot, they arrived at St Botolph's, and thank you ever so much to Richard from St Botolph's for sending me the record here. We've got Thomas's burial record and Thomas Ebrall. Name note at the top is where their parish was, and that's the Minories. He was a male, of course, marital status unknown. There's no marriage records for Thomas in that parish, and they were in that parish, so it's as if he was unmarried. And he was buried on the 25th of April 1810. Now, as I say, he was shot on the 9th and he died on the 17th. So this is 8 days after his death, and bearing in mind that April is a fairly mild month, as I say, he would have most likely been embalmed, or possibly a lead-lined coffin. That would have been a great expense though, so although they were middle class, it's possible that they could have afforded it. The coffin for a young man in those days would have generally have been of pine, oak or elm, and covered in black velvet with stud nails. That's the type of thing you got if you were a woman. You are unmarried, you got a lighter colour. If you were married, you got red generally. This is Thomas's burial record, and buried at St Botolph's, Aldgate. And the curate, or rector rather, at the time, who would have performed Thomas's burial service, is William Conybeare, and this is the man here himself. And this is a painting of a funeral procession making its way to that last journey. This painting is 1815, so this is 5 years after Thomas's actual funeral, but it represents pretty much what you would have got. Churchyards in those days were not neat and tidy affairs like we see them. They were ramshackle, and you might often see bits of bone lying around. And that, back in those days, was where Thomas's story ended, because try as they might, they couldn't find the so-called life guardsman. And the last verse on the headstone, I think, was probably Thomas's mother or father's little bit of heartbreak and anger that the person couldn't be found. So to their mind, they would leave that justice up to God. Sadly, Thomas's father did die of heartbreak, and that's a very sad thing. He was a 48-year-old man, had a good business and a trade of his own. So from the death of one young man, he destroyed an entire family. There's no record of Thomas's mother, who is called Sarah Ebrall, in the parish after 1810. Now, she and Thomas's father, Thomas Senior, they married the year before Thomas's birth. In 1784 they married at St Botolph's, and Thomas was born 1785. They had 6 other children, but after the death of Thomas, that family seems to disappear, so it looks as if she and the children that were left after the death of her son, then her husband, packed up and just moved somewhere else. She came from Norfolk, and that is noted in the marriage register that the father, Thomas Senior, was of St Botolph's. That was his parish, but she was of Norfolk, so she may have gone back home to Norfolk, bless her. And as I say, back then that was the end of the story, really. As try as they might to find who it was, they couldn't. But it isn't the end of the journey for Thomas's last remains. As I said to you, a large chunk of the churchyard was sold off, and that grave that contained the remains of both Thomases was dug up, and the remains, along with 6,000 other people, were cremated, and that grave now, or those remains now, lie in a mass grave in East London Cemetery, and that's where I'm going to take you to now, so join me there. Hi everyone, welcome back to the video. You join me in East London Cemetery, and this is that grave. Here rest the remains of 6,000 people of Aldgate, moved from St Botolph's Church, 1990. Lord have mercy. The bones were cremated, and they rest in a fairly sizable grave with the bones of 6,000 people. It was quite a lot, well, a normal sized grave, shall we say, from what I was told. You can see the grave's in a bit of a sad state at the moment. Some years ago, about 10 years ago, I cleaned this one up because one of my ancestors was buried in the church of St Botolph's without Aldgate, so their bones or ashes will rest amongst this lot here. Yeah, and these are the part of the problem that led to the poisonous well, the Aldgate pump epidemic. There we are. That's a little bit of London's darker past, and I hope you've all found that interesting or informative. Take care everyone, and thank you for watching.